The Buddha's first noble truth: pain is real, suffering is not. The Buddha began his explanation of the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, not with a definition, but with a list of common examples. The suffering of birth, aging, and death, of sorrow, lamentation, physical pain, distress, and despair, of association with the unbeloved, of separation from the loved, and of not getting what you want. Except for the last, none of these examples needs any explanation. The canon explains not getting what you want as referring to cases where you're subject to any of the other examples of suffering, such as aging, illness, and death, and want to be freed from them simply through the power of wishing or prayer. The frustration of not being able to wish these forms of suffering away does nothing but add more suffering on top of the suffering already there. Instead, as we've noted, you have to focus your desires on following a course of actions that will actually bring all these forms of suffering to an end. Up to this point, the Buddha's explanation of suffering deals in things that are perfectly familiar. We've all suffered in these ways ourselves, or seen other people suffer from them. Then, however, he summarizes the suffering common to all these examples, and this is where he enters unfamiliar territory. In short, he says, the 5 clinging aggregates are suffering. This, too, he says, is something we've all experienced, simply that we don't understand it in these terms. Only when we understand what he's referring to by this summary can we begin to comprehend the first noble truth. First, the words aggregate and clinging. Aggregate is a translation of the Pali word khanda, which means heap, group, or mass. It also means the trunk of a tree, a meaning that, we'll see, is actually relevant to this context. The use of the English term aggregate to translate khanda comes from a distinction, popular in 18th and 19th century European philosophy, between conglomerates of things that work together in an organic unity, called systems, and other conglomerates that are mere random collections of things, called aggregates. Translating khanda as aggregate conveys the useful point that even though the physical and mental processes that are classed as khandas can seem to have an organic unity, they're actually shaped by discrete choices. Still, it's important to bear in mind that the mind does shape the aggregates toward purposes, and that although those purposes can often be random or conflicting, they can also be more or less consistent, a fact that makes a path of practice possible. The 5 aggregates are: form, any physical phenomenon, although the Buddha's focus here is less on the physical object in itself and more on the experience of the object. In terms of your own body, the primary focus is on how the body is experienced from within. Feeling tones of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain. Perception, the act of recognizing, mentally labeling, and identifying experiences. Fabrication, the intentional shaping of experience. And consciousness, awareness at the 6 senses, the 5 physical senses plus the mind as the 6th. There's something of an anomaly in that the term fabrication in some contexts covers all 5 aggregates, and yet in others is listed as one of the 5. That's because the mental act of fabrication shapes your actual experience of all physical and mental phenomena in the dimensions of space and time. It chooses among the potentials for any of the aggregates made available by past actions and turns those potentials into the actual experience of those aggregates in the present. Fabrication, as a name for one of the aggregates, refers specifically to this mental process. As a term for all 5 aggregates, fabrication covers both the processes of fabrication and the fabricated phenomena, physical and mental, that result. It's important to note that the canon defines the aggregates in terms of verbs. Feelings feel, perceptions perceive, even form deforms, making the point that these aggregates are processes and activities rather than solid things. As for clinging aggregates, this expression doesn't mean that the aggregates cling. Instead, it refers to the act of clinging to the aggregates. In fact, the suffering lies in the clinging. The experience of the aggregates on their own, without clinging, may involve some stress, in that the aggregates continually change in dependence on conditions, but if there's no clinging, that stress doesn't weigh down the mind. This means that the suffering referred to in the first noble truth is the suffering of clinging. The aggregates aren't the problem. The clinging is. Still, to understand clinging, you need to get a sense of what it clings to. The question often arises, why did the Buddha choose to divide physical and mental experience into the categories of these 5 aggregates? Couldn't he have divided it up in other ways? The canon doesn't give an answer to this question, but it's worth noting that each of the aggregates is associated with the act of feeding. In the Buddha's analysis, the act of feeding is something that all beings have in common. In fact, that's how we define ourselves as beings, by latching on to these 5 activities as we feed. When you feed, either physically or emotionally, all 5 of these aggregates are involved. A sense of form. When you eat physical food, form refers both to the form of the body that needs to be nourished and that will be used to look for food, as well as to the physical objects that will be used as food. When you feed on your imagination, form applies to whatever form you assume for yourself in the imagination, and to the imaginary forms from which you take pleasure. Feeling. You start with the painful feeling of physical or mental hunger that drives you to look for food. Then there comes the pleasant feeling of satisfaction when you've found something to eat, followed by the added pleasure that comes when you actually eat it and assuage your hunger. Perception. You use perceptions to identify the type of hunger you feel, and to identify which of the things in your world of experience will satisfy that hunger. Perception also plays a role in identifying what is and isn't food. This, in fact, is one of our most basic perceptions. When children crawling across the floor encounter something new, they put it in their mouths to determine whether to perceive it as food or not. Fabrication. In the context of feeding, this covers the ways you contemplate and evaluate strategies for finding food, for taking possession of it when you find it, and for fixing it if it's not edible in its raw state. Consciousness is the act of being aware of all these activities. This shows that even though the term aggregate may not be familiar, it refers to activities that are not only very familiar to all beings, but also intimately connected to your sense of who you are. We are how we eat. When we use these activities to feed, they acquire positive associations in our minds. But in the first noble truth, the Buddha tells us that the act of clinging to them is suffering. This is the first point where his analysis of suffering goes against the grain. As for the Pali word for clinging, upadana, that means A, sustenance, and B, the act of taking sustenance, as when a tree takes sustenance from soil or a fire from its fuel. The same meaning applies to the mind. This is where the interpretation of khandha as the trunk of a tree is relevant. We feed off the aggregates in the same way that a fire feeds off the trunk of a tree as it burns. The implication here is that suffering comes from a double level of feeding. feeding emotionally off the activities that go into the act of feeding to ease our physical and emotional hunger. This is a second point that goes against the grain. Ordinarily, we enjoy clinging not only to our food, but also to the act of clinging itself. To accept the Buddha's analysis of suffering in the first noble truth, we have to develop some dispassion for the things to which we cling and for the act of clinging itself. This makes the first noble truth difficult to accept, but it's also what makes it noble. It teaches us to step back and raise ourselves above our hungers. We work toward this dispassion by following the duty that corresponds to this truth. Instead of running away from suffering or trying to push it away, we patiently observe it with the purpose of comprehending it. We need to see for ourselves how the suffering is not the mere fact of physical pain or stress. It's actually identical with the act of clinging. Full comprehension comes when we understand clinging to the point where we have no more passion, aversion, or delusion around it. A first step in comprehending clinging is to identify its various types. The Buddha lists 4, MN 11. Sensuality clinging, passion and desire to find pleasure in fantasizing about and planning sensual pleasures. View clinging, passion and desire for views about how the world is structured and how it works. Habit and practice clinging, passion and desire for ideas that tell you how you should act in the world. Doctrine of self-clinging, passion and desire for ways of defining who or what you are. This list may sound arbitrary and abstract until you realize that the Buddha, again, is talking about some very basic functions of the mind. Sensuality clinging deals with what you want in terms of sensuality. View clinging is concerned with your ideas about what the world is and how it works. Habit and practice clinging covers your ideas of how you have to act in the world to get what you want. It's focused on your ideas of what you should do, and doctrine of self-clinging relates to your sense of yourself as 1. An agent, capable of controlling events in an attempt to negotiate between what should be done, based on the way the world works and the wants of 2. The consumer who will find happiness when those wants are satisfied. Both of these senses of self are overseen by the self as 3. A commentator, who judges the actions of the agent to see if they satisfy the consumer, and to decide if the consumer should raise or lower its standards for satisfaction. These 3 functions of the self are your basic set of strategies for finding happiness. The first 3 types of clinging define the arena in which your self acts and searches for happiness. The balance of power among the 3 types will vary from person to person, and, even within a particular person, from moment to moment. On the occasions when you want to reject all constraints on trying to fulfill your sensual fantasies, you might be inclined to accept a materialist, deterministic worldview where sensual pursuits are not subject to moral judgments, and where the shoulds of the world counsel the pursuit of pleasure wherever you find it. This would be a case of sensuality clinging dictating your view of the world. At moments when you want to believe that your dignity as a human being lies in your ability to choose your actions, you'll be inclined to adopt a non-deterministic worldview where choice is real. This would be a case where habit and practice clinging dictates your view of the world and what your attitude toward sensuality should be. There are not a few cases where people change their worldview to fit in with their desires of the moment. there are also cases where their wants run up against the shoulds and what is of a worldview to which they're committed for other reasons. Modern psychology has detailed the suffering that comes from precisely this sort of internal conflict, one that's not limited only to those suffering from severe mental illness. Freud, for instance, described it as the ego's constant need to negotiate among the shoulds of the superego, the wants of the id, and the what is of the reality principle. Jung saw the issue as a clash between the shoulds and wants of the individual ego and the shoulds and wants of the unconscious. However you analyze it, this conflict is a common feature of the human condition. However, even though the first three types of clinging define the arena in which the self functions, the Buddha identified doctrine of self-clinging as the most basic type of clinging of all. In fact, only in a teaching where this type of clinging is comprehended, he said, can people reach awakening. That's because your sense of who you are explains why you're invested in seeing the world a certain way and in believing that certain things should be done in order to attain what you want. Without your desire to gain pleasure for yourself, views of the world or of how you should act wouldn't have much hold on the mind. This may be why, of all the different forms of clinging, doctrine of self-clinging is the one on which the Buddha focused the most attention when explaining how clinging gets fixated on the 5 aggregates. According to him, you can identify the self either as identical with any of the aggregates, as possessing any of the aggregates, as containing any of the aggregates, or as existing within any of the aggregates. For example, you might identify yourself as your body, or as the owner of your thoughts, or as an infinite consciousness containing all 5 aggregates, or a little person inside the body making use of its senses. These 4 possibilities multiplied by 5 aggregates give 20 possible self-identity views to which you might cling. So it follows that doctrine of self-clinging is the most important type of clinging to comprehend. And if we look carefully at the 3 roles of the self, we can see most clearly why clinging is suffering. The self as consumer, even though it enjoys feeding, is constantly hungry. As the Buddha said, even if it rained gold coins, that wouldn't be enough to satisfy one person's sensual desires. This means that the self as agent has to be constantly at work, negotiating among wants and shoulds, trying to gain a measure of control over the way things are, all in order to assuage the hunger of the consumer, with the self as commentator never giving it a moment's rest. However, you can't uproot your sense of self without also uprooting the other types of clinging as well. Given that the self is what negotiates the world and tries to figure out how to act to gain pleasure, its identity is strongly linked to its range of strategies and skills for finding what it wants. These, in turn, rely on how it sees what is and what should be done. You see this connection most clearly when you move into a different culture or when your own society undergoes radical change. The world is no longer what it used to be. The skills that used to get results come up empty-handed, and your very identity gets called into question. To survive, you need to construct a new self around new skills for negotiating the new arena in which you act. So, given that the roots of the self are entangled in its desires, its worldviews, and its ideas of what should be done, if you want to put an end to suffering, you not only have to uproot your sense, or senses, of self, you also have to uproot the other 3 types of clinging: your attachment to sensuality, and to your sense of how you should act, given your views on how the world works. These facts about suffering define the strategy of the remaining 3 noble truths. Suffering can't be ended until you abandon the desires that lead to clinging. This is the message of the second truth on the origination of suffering. But those desires won't go away simply by wishing for them to go. A first step in abandoning them requires developing an alternative set of desires with a new sense of who you are, of how the world works, and of how you should act in response to these new views. In other words, you need to use desire and clinging in the quest to end desire and clinging. That's the strategy of the fourth noble truth, the path to the end of suffering. Once the path has done its work, you can abandon it too. When the mind is totally free of desire and clinging, it can realize the third noble truth, suffering's end. Antidotes for clinging. There are some places in the Pali Canon where the Buddha says that the 5 aggregates are stressful, and others where he says the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. It's important to notice here that he's talking about 2 different kinds of stress. The sense in which the 5 aggregates are stressful is related to stress in terms of the 3 characteristics. They're inconstant, and so they're stressful. That's simply the way they are, whether you hold on to them or not. But if you don't grab onto these things, your mind doesn't suffer. It's when you grab on, it's when you cling, that stress comes into the mind. You create a clinging aggregate. You create a connection. This is stress in terms of the 4 noble truths. Wherever there's craving, there can be clinging, and the clinging to the aggregates is the stress that really weighs on the mind. When we practice, our main focus is on the stress in the 4 noble truths, the stress that weighs on the mind. If you don't cling to the things that are stressful, then they can be as stressful as they want, but the stress doesn't come in and weigh you down. It's like picking up a heavy object. If you just leave it there on the ground, it doesn't weigh you down. It weighs the same whether you're picking it up or not. When you pick it up, it's 50 pounds. When you leave it on the ground, it's 50 pounds. The difference is that the 50 pounds is suddenly on top of you when you pick it up, and that's when you suffer. That's precisely the stress the Buddha is focusing on. That's the important one to notice. Always try to be clear about this distinction. The real problem isn't the aggregates, it's the clinging, and the word clinging has a double meaning. It can also mean the act of feeding on something. Where we cling is where we look to feed for happiness. We look to the 5 aggregates for food. We munch them down, and then they munch us down. We feed on the form of the body. We feed on feelings, perceptions, thought constructs, and sensory consciousness. When these things are pleasant, they're not too heavy. But they can turn around and turn unpleasant very quickly. They gobble us up, for we've opened the way for them to get to us. Once you start clinging to the good ones, you start clinging to the bad ones as well, because that's where you're looking for food. So it's important to understand clinging so that you can put an end to it. As the Buddha said, there are 4 kinds. There's sensual clinging, clinging to views, clinging to habits and practices, and then clinging to doctrines of the self. All of these hover around the 5 aggregates. They're different ways of clinging to the 5 aggregates, and the Buddha has a different cure for each. Sometimes you hear that the deepest, most underlying form of clinging is the sense of self-identity that you build around things. If you learn how not to have any sense of self-identity, there you are. You've taken care of all the other forms of clinging. Sometimes you hear that clinging to views is the basic form of clinging. If you can deconstruct all your views, you'll be done with all the other forms of clinging as well. So you reason your way to seeing how you can't say that things exist. You can't say that things don't exist, or both, or neither. They're empty. That means that your sensual desire is empty. Your habits and practices are empty. Your doctrines of the self are empty. With everything empty like that, there's nothing to cling to. But that doesn't work either. After letting things go in this way, you'll find that your sensual desires weren't touched. You just turn around and pick them back up. So you have to realize that each kind of clinging has its own antidote. For example, clinging to sensuality. When the Buddha talks about sensuality, he doesn't say that you're attached to sights or sounds. The word kama or sensuality here doesn't mean beautiful or desirable sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations. It means the plans and intentions you have around these things. That's what we're really focused on. We're all attached to the ideas we have of the things we want, wanting them to be a certain way to give us pleasure. In other words, we're more attached to our dreams and plans about sensual pleasures than we are to the sensual pleasures themselves. This is simple enough to see. If you find your sensual desire thwarted in one area, you turn around and you focus it on something else. The desire is what we cling to. We cling to the plans that we make for sensual pleasure. And what are these plans like? For the most part, they're pretty one-sided and sketchy. Say you have designs on somebody else's body. When you think about that person's body, there are only certain details that you think about. A lot of details you don't want to think about at all. Or when you think about a particular relationship, you think about only certain aspects of the relationship and not about others. So the antidote here is to broaden your view, to see that your pursuit of pleasure in this way carries a lot of pain along with it. When the Buddha talks about the drawbacks of sensuality, he starts with the fact that in order to lead a sensual lifestyle, you've got to work. The work in and of itself is painful and wearisome. You work and work and work to build up wealth. Sometimes you gain it, sometimes you don't. Even when you do gain it, there's the fear that, as he says, thieves and kings will steal it. I like the way the Buddha always mentions kings and thieves in the same breath. Water might wash it away, fire might burn it, hateful airs could take off with it. That can easily happen to your wealth. And as the Buddha points out, it's over sensuality that people fight. Parents fight with their children. Children fight with their parents. Brothers with sisters. Sisters with brothers. Husband with wife. Wife with husband. And not just in the family. There are wars over sensual pleasures as well, because we need to take wealth to pay for our passions, which are far greater than all the wealth in the world. That's how we end up going to war. The Buddha goes down a long list of all the pains and sufferings tied up with this pursuit of our dreams of sensuality. So, as you look at the pursuit of sensuality in its entirety, you realize how much pain and suffering it involves. You don't have to look too far. This contemplation we have of the requisites every day, thinking about food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, just the fact that we have a body makes us a burden on other people. So think about that. Every time your mind starts spinning a web of sensual desire, tell yourself, if you're going to spin a web, spin the full web. Try to encompass the whole picture. like that daydream that a John Lee reports in his autobiography from the time he was planning to disrobe. At first it starts out really nice. He even gets a nobleman's daughter for his wife. But then the reality principle starts kicking in. Eventually, because she's a nobleman's daughter, she's not up to the hard work that's required in marrying a peasant's son. She dies and leaves him with a child to raise. He gets a second wife. The second wife has a kid of her own and starts playing favorites, abusing the first kid, and so on down the line. When we bring in reality like this, it helps cut through a lot of our delusions around sensuality, a lot of our attachment to sensual designs, sensual plans, sensual dreams, or you can contemplate the body in all its parts. You can think of a beautiful body, but when you think of the parts inside, you say, woo. Just a few micrometers below the skin, there's all this other stuff, and it's inextricably connected with the things you like. Suppose you lust for somebody. You don't like the idea of their intestines, but if you took their intestines out, would you like that person without any intestines? It's not worth taking either way, with or without a liver, with or without a stomach. So when you think in these ways, you begin to realize that your sensual plans and desires are really unrealistic, really misleading. They make you half blind so that they can take you down a path to suffering. Realizing this helps cut through the sensuality. You see how arbitrary all these dreams are, that you can't rely on them. That's what helps you let them go. As for clinging to views, the Buddha has you follow a similar process, but with different details. The process is that he has you look at the drawbacks that come from clinging to a view. One of the major drawbacks being that you inevitably get into arguments with other people. But more than that, the Buddha has you look carefully at the things you have views about. This is where the details differ, and the analysis goes into more technical terms. Your views come down to the question of what exists and what doesn't exist, he says. But when you actually look at your sensory experience, you just see things arising and passing away. As you focus on the arising, the idea of non-existence doesn't occur to you. As you focus on the passing away, the idea of existence doesn't occur to you. You realize that the basic building blocks of experience, when you look at them just on the level of arising and passing away, don't provide a foundation for the very basic polarities of existing and not existing. On top of that, any views you build are sketches based on not looking at things very carefully. So the Buddha has you look very carefully at the process of what it's like to experience things. When you see that views really can't express the truth about things, and that holding on to them is going to cause you to suffer, you can cut through your attachment to them. As for habits and practices, he first has you look at the actual habits or precepts and practices you're attached to. The attachment here is to the idea that if you follow certain rules and you're a good little boy, a good little girl, that's all you have to do. God will be happy with you, or the universe will approve of you, or whatever. So the Buddha has people look directly at their habits and practices together with their results, some of which are actively harmful. Back in his days, sacrifices were believed to be a way to find true happiness. So he talked about looking at the misery that comes through the sacrifices, not only for the animals sacrificed, but also for the people forced to labor in getting the animals killed. Self-torture, as a form of austerity, was also a popular practice in some circles. So he had you look at the pain that comes from it, to see that it doesn't really lead anywhere. It doesn't really help cleanse the mind. So in this way, he'd get people to abandon harmful habits and practices and replace them with good habits and good practices, the habits we adopt as part of our virtue, the practices we follow in the practice of meditation. But eventually, he says to watch out. If you're not careful, you're going to create a sense of conceit around these things, the pride that comes sometimes when I follow the precepts and you don't, or my jhana is better than yours. The way to get beyond that attachment is not to break the precepts or drop your practice of jhana. It's simply to continue with those practices while learning how not to develop a sense of conceit around them. Realize that you're doing these things not to make yourself better than other people, but simply because they work in cleansing the mind. Finally, there's clinging to doctrines of self. This doesn't mean just the view that I have a self, whatever your sense of self might be. It also means clinging to the view that I have no self. Thinking in either way, the Buddha said, leads you into a thicket of views that will get you entangled. So, as with the cure for clinging to views, the Buddha has you take the polarity of existence or non-existence and put it aside. When the issue of existing or not existing is a non-issue, the idea of a self existing or not existing is a non-issue as well. Instead, the Buddha has you look at things simply in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Where is stress arising? What is the cause of that stress? What's the path to the end of that stress? As you divide up your experience in those terms, the whole issue of who you are or who you're not just gets put aside. You're more focused on what you're doing that's causing stress, learning how to comprehend the stress, learning how to abandon the cause through developing the path, so that ultimately you can realize the end of stress, the end of suffering. That's the way out of that type of clinging. So when you find the mind clinging, weighing itself down with its attachment to the aggregates, try to be clear about exactly which kind of clinging you're suffering from and what the antidote is, what the medicine that the Buddha prescribed, because it's different in each case. There's no one blanket cure to cover every form of clinging. You've got to develop your discernment from many angles, develop discernment with many facets. Essentially, every approach involves seeing things in terms of being inconstant, stressful, and not self, but those principles get applied in different ways for each type of clinging. So try to keep this list of medicines in mind and apply them as appropriate. That way, you put yourself in a position where you're living in a world that's stressful, but you're not pulling the stress inside. You can live surrounded by inconstancy, stress, and not self, but not suffer from it.